Okay.
We're rolling.
Thank you, Professor Haberman, for being here. I appreciate the time and opportunity to talk with you.
Glad to do it.
Maybe we could start with a background on you, similar like we did when we were on the phone.
Mm-hmm.
Give me a sketch of how it is you come to do the work that you do, both in terms of the kind of your academic learning course, but also what grips you in the gut, what motivates you to do what you do.
What motivates me to do what I do? Well, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell. I don't want to waste a lot of your time. I got into teaching as an older adult myself. I was over 25 and I had a lot of experience working at various jobs before I got into teaching. And I saw that I had certain advantages having had experiences in the world of work and in various different subject matters. So that when I left my teacher education preparation at Columbia and came to Wisconsin, I followed up with a program for adults to become teachers who had already been in other fields of study and had already worked at various jobs. And that model became the National Teacher Corps in the 1960s. And so I had an opportunity to work with about 100,000 people in 80 different universities around the country when I was still very young and starting, so that I had the opportunity to develop a lot of teacher education programs, find out what was wrong with them and what was right with them. And that's what I've been doing for the last 40 years. But the focus of all those teacher education programs has been on children in poverty, children of diverse cultural backgrounds in urban schools, because that's where I think the great need is. Now, how I got interested in equity and justice would be a whole personality trip of how I was raised. But there was one thing in particular that really pushed me hard when I was developing my interest in teaching and how to prepare teachers. It was during the Korean War. And during the Korean War, there was a draft. It wasn't a volunteer army or state National Guards. And in the early 50s, we used the national test, the selective service used the national test. And if it was essentially a vocabulary test of 30 words, and if you knew these 30 words, you could stay in college. You didn't have to go to Korea. And if you didn't know these 30 words, you were drafted and went to Korea. And that had a terrific impact on me when I realized that our society is saying the way you judge the worth of people is by a 30-word vocabulary test. In effect, these people are expendable, and these people can go on with their lives in college. We wouldn't dare do that today. I'm talking about 51 years ago. We would never do that or get away with it today, but the injustice of it, 55,000 people were killed in Korea, and I guess most of them didn't know the 30 words on the vocabulary test. Those of us that knew them went to college. So that really pushed me into seeing that the preparation of teachers is not just a happy little pastime. It has great implications both for specific individuals and for the society as a whole. How do you decide things? That's a long-winded answer, but that's part of my motivation. I want to get people who are from low-income, diverse backgrounds better teachers, because there's about 15 million of them right now and they're being miseducated. And
you remember any of the words? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, I remember. I remember some of the words. Naive, sophisticated, I'm not sure about revanchist, but I think revanchist might have been one of the words. It was in downtown New York City, and it was clear that it was the black guys and the Italian guys who were going, and it was the Jewish guys who were going back to college. In my group, it was done by neighborhood, so there were 30 of us from the same high school, and 25 or 30 of us, I don't know the exact number, and we all passed, and there was some ignorant sergeant from some place down south who thought we cheated because 25 or 30 guys knew all 30 words. So he put us in a room and gave us a test again. He couldn't believe that all these guys knew these words. You shouldn't be shocked by this, because if you look even now at a test for how psychologists determine who's normal, a good part of the test is vocabulary. I can show you the test in the office. In other words, if you had a problem now, if one of your heirs said that you didn't have the intelligence to manage your estate, or that your will was incorrect and they challenged your sanity, the tests used to determine whether you were sane or not would be primarily vocabulary words, and I can show you the test. It'd be remembering numbers and vocabulary, and the vocabulary would be judged, so you'd be asked to define a word, and then you'd get 2 points if you gave this definition of it, but 1 point if you gave another definition of it, and then so on. And so while we don't draft people into the Army and get them killed on vocabulary tests anymore, we still use it to judge who's sane or not. And these essentially are the procedures used to decide which kids are normal or not. 20% of our kids in this city are labeled abnormal, and the major part of their test is a vocabulary test. And they're primarily low income and children of color. If you were to tell the people in the suburbs that 1 out of every 5 of their kids was abnormal, the schools would close. But in the big cities, it's considered perfectly reasonable to define 20% of the kids as abnormal.
Does that reflect the difference in the advocates for those children?
Yes, it reflects the culture. Schools always reflect the culture that they're in. And the city culture is different than a suburban or a small town culture. And so everything that happens in a city school has to be sifted through the bureaucracy of the school system, and the people feel helpless. They can't control it. They're distanced from it. So the school system can get away with more egregious. That may be one of the words that was on the test.
And one of the things that we know today is that about 70-80% of our vocabulary by the time we're in the 5th or 6th grade has come out of reading.
Yeah. But then there's the difference is that other 30% that gives you the patina of separating the people who have opportunity for greater access from just the mass of people who... Getting back to this word testing thing, in the state of Massachusetts, the last data I saw was that 28% of the African American kids are special ed. How can a state have 28% of its kids? It's almost 1 out of every 3 kids labeled abnormal in some way. It's an interesting tragedy. It's both a personal tragedy and a social one. We had here in Milwaukee a guy, Jeffrey Dahmer, who killed 22 people, made love to the dead bodies, and then ate them. And 4 PhD board-certified psychologists swore under oath that he was sane. And it was done primarily on the basis of testing recall of numbers, word definitions, and then a lot of great questions like, would you rather read a book or go to a party? In other words, in our society, we use tests as a better predictor of behavior, a more valid predictor of behavior than the actual behavior. So if a person kills 22 people and eats them and makes love to the dead bodies, that doesn't carry as much weight with people as a test that's supposed to predict that person's behavior. It's the same with SATs and ACTs. We know women do better in college than men. They get better grades and they learn more because they study and they do their work more than men. So we know in terms of behavior, the women get more out of college. So we use tests. We can't use actual behavior, see? So we use tests to predict how they're going to do. And say, well, you see, the tests show they didn't score as well on math and science, or some other field or something. So we don't use reality. We use tests. And getting back to kids in school, particularly low-income and diverse kids in school, before we label them handicapped or special ed, we do look at their behavior. But that part of the determination is never as important as the test scores. Never. Part of that is the teachers determine and explain the behavior. They'll say, well, he's 5 years old, that's true, but he keeps taking his shoes off, or he takes his shirt off in class. Those kinds of observations from teachers about kids are supplementary or extra or complementary or ancillary. The important thing is what the state-certified psychologist said he did on the test. That's what's important. So,
to some degree, isn't this a reflection of the control mechanism, the way the institutional assessment mechanisms, because the institution doesn't have a way to capture or rely upon the subjective impressions of teachers?
Yeah, that's part of it, but the bottom line is lawsuits. What holds up in court, school systems don't want to get sued. So they'll engage in the most illogical, anti-common sense, hurtful things that destroy kids' lives to protect themselves from lawsuits. It's all done. The bottom line is to protect yourself from a lawsuit. And the easiest thing to do in a lawsuit is to have a certified person whose expertise can be approved by the court or by a jury. So test scores, things that are more objective, are considered more scientific and more considered valid. The whole thing is a monstrous misunderstanding.
So it's this investment of inferential authority in the way that all this
Sure.
is collected that
Sure.
perpetuates itself.
Sure. If 2 of us testify and I say that sometimes happens, and you say, well, the answer is 6, my testimony will trump your testimony. But the bottom line is that if you look at the 120 largest districts miseducating 15 million kids, majority of those kids are white kids who are poor, but there's a disproportionate number of African American and Hispanic and other minorities in that 15 million. 7 million of them are in the 120 largest districts. They're really being miseducated and killed. They're being killed. based on procedures that are driven by how do we protect the system, not based on policies and procedures of what's in the best interest of the kids or society.
This is a whole other dimension, this kind of institutional politics piece. Normally we step across the line from that, and then we have the argument or explore the difference between a instruction-oriented paradigm, which is analogous to Renaissance cannon fire. Fire this thing, see where the dust cloud goes, measure, shoot again, and there's this kind of thing, as if there's actually no way to have any contact with the interior process in the learner, engage in any kind of connection with them that could provide a basis for a different kind of heuristic than that statistical, probabilistic stuff. But that sounds like that's even a much better case than what you're describing. Of a system that's so institutionally self-insulating and protective because of the kind of administrative, bureaucratic, legal machinations.
Well, there's a lot of people who benefit. I just read a want ad for a superintendent in a New York State district of 235 special ed kids whose salary is advertised as $170,000. So here's a district, I think it was Dobbs Ferry, some place not far outside of Manhattan. So here you have 235 kids in the district. You're going to pay the superintendent $170,000 a year to administer it. There'll probably be some teachers there who are earning $30,000 or $35,000. It's a very self-serving. It's obvious what's happening here. We've created a system that supports adults and provides jobs. If you look at any big city, for example, particularly this one, the largest employer is the school district, more than any factory or other governmental unit. Or there's about 6,300 teachers in this city. There's over 12,000 employees. Then there's another few thousand part-time employees who come and go. So people get jobs out of this. There's a lot of people. You can't get the parents wanting to tear down a system because they're miseducating the kids, because the parents are earning money from that system. Maybe both parents are employed in that system. It becomes very complicated. Suppose somebody is a food service worker and somebody else is a bus driver, and they have 2 or 3 jobs out of the system, but the system is miseducating their kid. They're not going to join some hippie movement that says destroy the Milwaukee public schools. Also, their own miseducation leads them to believe that the school system can somehow change and improve itself. After 50 years of intense effort and 100 years of watching this happen, I mean, this is quite a myth. It's supported a lot by the media. The daily newspapers, the television and radio are very linked in to maintaining the fiction that big city schools can change and improve. That it is possible if we change the school board, if we get a better superintendent, if we have more parents go to meetings, if we get more money from the state, if we adopt the Bumstead reading program and get rid of the Humperdinck reading program, if we put in after-school tutoring, the media help maintain this myth very well. For example, you don't read we know from the media that there were 2,795 people killed on 9/11. The media don't report that 3,000 kids drop out of school every day. when I talk to teachers, they're always shocked. They don't know. They don't know what the rates are in their own city, let alone nationally. 3,000 kids drop out of school every day. Yeah, well, we create a city the size of Chicago every 2.5 years, filled with kids who never finished high school, no-hopers and pregnant teenagers, kids who are on drugs, push-outs as well as dropouts. City the size of Chicago every 2.5 years. What the media would have us believe is that terrorism is the national priority. The politicians help, but the media support the notion that terrorism is the biggest national problem when it's miseducating our people, obviously. The society can't go on building millions of kids every 2.5 years who will never have decent jobs. Or if you're not a high school graduate, you'll never have a decent job with health insurance. You'll never be able to send your kid to a better school than the one that miseducated you. Ta-da, 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 ta-da. So another thing that the media do, which is just pure laziness, is that they accept the reports from the school district. So if the school district reports, as one did in Texas, that they have no dropouts, the media report that. Then they have an investigative reporter and find out, oh yeah, they just said everybody was transferred. Turns out 60% of the kids drop out. But the media accept the reports of the school districts because reporters and interviewers find it easier to do that than to go through the data themselves. So we read all the time how much it costs in the school for this piece of education, or how many kids have dropped out, or what the achievement scores are. All that is fake data. It's self-reported data from the school districts themselves. It's very rarely even close to accurate. And so what this connects with is your previous question. Why do people put up with school systems that are destroying their own children? Well, part of it, as I explained, they benefit by having jobs in the big cities or by having direct payments. If you're a special ed parent and they categorize your kid in certain categories, you suddenly get $350, $400 a month. And if you tell a poor single mother that we're going to help Jerome and we're going to give you $350 a month, she's liable to do it. So there's direct payments to parents. There's giving parents jobs and other people in the community jobs because these big systems are the largest employers.
Take, for example, on that point, in this area here, how many people live in Milwaukee?
In the city itself, there's about 600,000.
So you said there's 12,000 employees in the school system?
More. There's more than that, right. See, when I first came here, the city population was approaching 1 million. But over the last 42 years, population of the city has gone down. But in order to work in the schools, you have to be a resident of the city. So we know that more than 12,000 people work in the public schools, and they're all residents of the city.
How many children live in Milwaukee that
go to public schools? A few years ago it was 105,000. We're down now to 89. So every year, that's an interesting point, and this is true nationally, not just in this city, nationally. As the number of kids goes down in the school district, the budget goes up. It's like the British Navy. As the number of ships in the British Navy went down, the amount of people employed by the Admiralty on land went up. So what we have a system, even adjusting for inflation, is a system where the budget increases every year and the number of employees in the system increase. Now, we've had a few hundred teachers fired, and some cities are doing that now. They're getting rid of their art and music teachers and so on. But their total budget is not going down, and their total number of employees is not going down, if you include part-timers and so on. This simple question, if you were to ask a superintendent of schools, say, Jones, how many people work in your school district? Which to ordinary people sounds like a very simple question. What the superintendent would do would be to call a meeting.
Yeah, the second one. We just lost the lights above. I want to check what the effect of that is.
I think you can turn it on again. You just have to have movement in the room. Oh, it's one of those things where if you don't have movement in the room, it goes off. So if you walk over here toward the middle of the room, you will automatically turn it on again.
That's amazing.
If, in other words, to save electricity, if there's no movement in the room,
No, it makes perfect
hand it out at a school board meeting, then to find out the facts for yourself, get the data yourself. And budget data is particularly hard to come by for reporters because the way accountants in the system, they can hide millions of dollars by the way they group and categorize funds, so that reporters or people who are not accountants and knowledgeable about school systems can't dig in and find out how much was actually spent for.
Sounds like there'd be some kind of media watchdog thing just for the
There should be. And it's usually in the big cities, it's usually the newest reporter or the reporter with the least experience who gets the school beat. It's almost like night court. You know, the reporters start out covering night court or the schools. They have to work their way up into, you know, following the governor or getting a good beat, so that the reporters it's not difficult to fool them or to give them reports that are official. And it's not just reporters, it's educational researchers. Educational researchers get data from the school districts. When they ask them, as happened in Texas, how many graduated? Or what are the test scores? The test scores are reported. How many kids are in the school district? School districts get paid by the state based on students' attendance. So they have a vested interest in directly lying about that, and just about every school district does. There's a phenomenon called ghosts. Ghosts refer to the number of kids who on the third Friday in September or whatever the magic date is that they count the kids in a school district for purposes of state aid. They're there that first day. In this city, for example, we give out bicycles, we give them free hamburgers at McDonald's, we give tickets for all kinds of stuff. We just bring them in from the shopping malls and from everywhere. And somewhere in the course of the year, I would guess between 7,000 and 8,000 of them are not there, but they're there for purposes of state aid. Then what happens, but the reporters and all, the state will take attendance reports from the district. But then the district knows that this is going on. So as they give the budgets to the individual schools, they make a deduction for ghosts. In other words, there's a perfect example of bureaucratized fraud. The system knows that the kids they've reported to the state is an overblown number, but they keep that number, get the aid. They just then deduct that from what they send to the individual schools, and they keep that as a creaming for the central office or for the bureaucracy in general. So they'll say to a school, well, 3%, 5% of your kids are really not in attendance. So we'll take that equivalent amount of money, $7,000 a kid, $8,000, whatever it is per kid, and we'll keep that in a central office pot.
So they report the numbers
Yeah.
from below above to get the money.
That's
They
right.
discount it. based on
That's
their
right.
perception.
That's right. If you did this with the mafia in a gambling casino, you'd end up with a concrete girdle in the Passaic River. But in the education business, it's standard practice. So I'm just giving you one example. I could give you 1,000 other examples of how school systems hand out reports and fairly arrogant, ignorant media people accept them and then write stories using them. And they write stories about the achievement. They write stories about that look very factual. They have that have numbers in them. They present papers present tables of how many kids are in ex-ed, attendance, dropouts. When you get into and by the way, I don't want to just hit the media. It's professors of education. As the quote researchers gather data to do annual or nationwide surveys of how many of this and that, where do you think they get their data? They get their data from what the district tells them about attendance, learning, dropouts, suspensions, violence. So somebody will do a study on how much violence is there in the United States, and they'll publish, well, this is self-report data from the school district. For example, Texas leads the nation in corporal punishment. In 22 states in the United States, it's legal to hit kids. That means in their infinite wisdom, the state legislatures of 22 states are saying that beating the client is a very useful learning tool. And it's legal in 22 states. Now, each state goes about it differently, but Texas is just too good to pass up. They have rules. When you hit the kid, it has to be done with a smile. It can't be done in anger. It has to be done on a certain part of the body. It has to be done in front of a witness. It has to be done, there's rules, and then you file a report. Well, for last year, there was something like 550,000 instances of corporal punishment in Texas. Now, if you have to fill out a report, if a teacher has to fill out a report every time they paddle a kid, wouldn't you assume that there's more going on than is represented by the number of reports filed? Wouldn't you assume that reports filed represent 5%, 10%, 20%, that most of the corporal punishment, you don't fill out 4 pages in 5 copies each, that takes an hour and a half to do it. So when the quote, it isn't just the media people who misrepresent the failures of the school, it's the quote science, the people with doctorates who do the research, So we have a report on how extensive is corporal punishment in the United States, and there'll be a table and a chart, or maybe a trend line from year to year. It'll all look very scientific, but this is all self-report data. So it doesn't matter what the topic is, whether it's reading scores or whatever. If you're dependent on what the people you're trying to expose are telling you, I mean, come on. How do you get at this? Well, you have to be quite clever and you have to work at it, and you can't assume that what they're just telling you is, it's like the fights on campus. When the campus police show up and break up a brawl in a dorm, they always get the same answer. They say to the kids, have you been drinking? And 98% or more of the kids always say, quote, oh, I had a beer or two. I had a beer or two. You discover that a keg was consumed. You discover that fantastic amounts have been purchased. But when you ask for a self-report, any policeman will tell you that most of the time the report is, oh, I had a beer or two. I just can't walk very well and I'm all bloody by accident and so on. But, if it weren't the lives of the children that were at stake, it would be funny. It would be funny when you see what these districts report.
Let's pause right here for a second. The microphone?
Yeah, I'm
Kind of straighten it so that as he moves around, it doesn't necessarily cause this thing to pull. How are we doing on time? You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. You want to ask more questions or make more comments? I don't want to just keep talking.
Actually, the stuff that you're saying is just beautiful. Exactly how we're going to cut it, where we're going to cut it, I don't know, but it's wonderful to have. And I appreciate that perspective. Yeah. I mean, we talked about it on the phone, it's like, there's a growing consensus at one level in all of this, that there's just nothing more important than the health of our children's learning. I mean, if we step back as stewards of society at any level, I mean, whatever's going to happen to humanity is going to happen depending on what happens to the children and how well they learn.
You mustn't assume that the people who work in schools care about kids any more than the people who work in department stores or who drive taxis or who work in offices. And that's certainly true among professors who prepare the teachers. I never met any who can't sleep at night because the kids in the district aren't reading well. There's no connections. But there's a feeling that you get into teaching because you, quote, love children, and that the school district is a place that just gurgles forth all this love. And the school system is like the post office or the phone company or the Army or American Express or Standard Oil or whatever. It's just another place where people go to work every day. They're worried about themselves, their status, their salary. There's no sense of urgency. It doesn't matter whether it's Chicago or Milwaukee or Boston or LA or any of the 120 largest districts. You don't find people running around with a sense of urgency. We're killing our children. Do you know how many dropped out today? Why don't we do something? There's no... people are going to meetings. People are sitting around with yellow pads going to meetings, and when you ask them what they accomplished this week, they take out their books. They say, well, look at how busy I am. In fact, I have 2 meetings scheduled at the same time for 40% of the week. I'm on this committee. I'm on this task force. I'm writing a report to the superintendent and the board about this. Everybody's very busy and working real hard. The value system, as I indicated, with the $170,000 a year for the superintendent of 235 kids, the further you are away from children, the less you have to do with children, the higher your status and the more money you get paid. So the people who work closest with the children, for example, in any big city, the people who spend the most time with most of the problem kids are aides. They're people earning $12,000 a year, $15,000 a year. Teacher kicks somebody out of the room, either a paraprofessional or a safety aide or a teaching assistant, sits with the kid or tries to tutor him in reading. So the people closest to the problems are earning them. Then you get to the teachers. Then you get to the counselors and the assistant principals and the reading resource teachers. And you go up the scale, and then you get to the principal, and then you get to this. The further away you are from the kids, the less impact you have on anybody's learning directly, the higher your status, money. Now, that should tell you something. That should help you to understand for whose benefit is this system running. In just about any city, the bus system works pretty well. In our city, it's the 3rd largest one in the state, after Madison and Milwaukee. It's the 3rd largest bus system in the state. Works very well. The bookkeeping office, the accounting office works very well. Thousands of employees get paid every 9 days. Some get paid every 2 weeks. Some get paid every month. There's a special office. If there's anything wrong with your check, they'll fix it immediately the same day. You just go right to this office. So this very complex accounting system, the payroll system, works. The food system is wonderful. We really feed our kids. We have wonderful meals served by caring people. The 4th system is the building repair system, the quality of the repairs. The actual physical plant system is a great system. You won't find broken windows. You won't find unsafe conditions. All the systems of the school system work. There's only one system that's not working, and that has to do with teaching and learning. All the systems that have to do with the welfare of the adults are all working real well. They work efficiently. They're well paid. They're organized. You look at any big city school system, the postal system works. All the mail goes out on time. All the mail comes in on time. You can pick any subsystem, and it's working real well. It's working. The personnel offices are hiring people. They're doing the criminal checks, filling out the forms, getting references. People are getting hired. People are being terminated. People are going on medical leave. The systems are all working. If they're there for the welfare of the adults, they're all working real well. They're also quite expensive. In the big cities, they're using up about 60% or more of the money, and the kids are getting about 40%. In the small towns and suburbs, there's about 20% of the money goes for administration, 25% the most. 75% goes directly for the teaching and things that service children directly. So
I think it would be just the opposite.
you would think it
In
was
terms
just
of
the opposite, yeah.
Economies of scale and
Yeah, right. I'm not talking about something that's accidental or that happened 1 year. If you flipped a coin 50 times, representing 50 years, and then another 120 times 50, representing each of the 120 districts for each of those 50 years. You said, if all these systems get worse every year for 50 years, would there be factors other than chance? Or would this whole thing just be due to ignorance? The solution is the Bumstead reading program. The solution is, well, fine, it'd be better to have a reading program, and we do have some reading programs that are better than others, that's true. But what you have are massive systems operated for the benefit of adults, miseducating kids, and it's really a life and death matter. And as bad as the bureaucracies of the schools are, and as self-serving as they are, what we do in the colleges of education is even worse. We're not even accountable. No parents ever pick at a school of education. Say, how come you sent me teachers that can't teach them to read? How come you sent us teachers who hit the kids rather than motivate them? How come you send us teachers who stay 6 months and leave?
isn't this the question Congress is starting to ask now? Is
Well,
there any special inquiry into just colleges of education and their...
Yeah, but I'm betting on the colleges of education. We're very well insulated. We withstood Sputnik in 1957. The Russians were ahead of us in the space, and President Eisenhower said, this is a national emergency. We can't let the Russians destroy us. And they suddenly started putting money into the National Defense Education Act, and all the schools of education were given money to prepare science and math teachers to catch the Russians. I'm talking about 47 years ago. Okay? Well, so money went out to the colleges of education to prepare math and science teachers. Now in 2004, guess what? Pick your city: Baltimore, Atlanta, Portland, Seattle, Washington, D.C., San Antonio. Pick your city. Which city has science and math teachers in it? Which teachers have middle schools where people know enough science and math to be teaching the kids? So we've had government initiatives depending on, but the professional lobby groups that represent schools and colleges, we're protected in the same way as the school bureaucracies are protected from. They're protected by the media, they're protected by their communities, they're protected from all the people who sell them books, they're protected by all the various constituencies that benefit. The schools of education are protected. We're not accountable any more than the schools are for the quality of our teachers. This institution's been here over 100 years, and except for the study I did, We've never done a study following up how well our graduates do with the kids. We don't know how many of them stay. We don't know how well they do. It's a very complicated study to do. It's never been done. But you would think, we started in 1896 as a teacher's college. You would think in 108 years, somebody would have said, hey, why aren't we accountable? And this is true across the country. You could pick any.
At least have a heuristic, a feedback loop to help guide them.
Yeah, the truth is that most of the people we prepare never even work in these schools. Most of the teachers prepared in schools and colleges of education never work in the 120 largest districts where they're needed. The real big teacher education factories are in Illinois, Michigan, Ohio. And they're in small towns. They don't turn out teachers for Chicago or Detroit or the major urban areas. In the state of New York, the teachers' colleges in SUNY, State University in New York, prepares 17,000 roughly teachers a year. Nobody can ever find one of those 17,000 who ever applied to the New York City schools. In most years, it's zero. So if you have a system, but the lobby groups can protect themselves from any kind of criticism, where else would one prepare teachers except in colleges of education? How dare he say that we're failing? And so they'll produce some program that has 30 teachers in it that's working in the Memphis schools and say, you see what we're doing? We got these 30 people, or we got these. They have boutique programs that they'll start in every big city. This was another experience I had with the Teacher Corps. We had 100,000 people. We gave the money to 80 universities for 9 years. When the money ran out from the federal government, not one of the 80 universities continued the program. Not one. Can something like that be due to chance? Can 0 out of 80 be due to chance, or are there factors operating other than chance? Most of the people we prepared in the Teacher Corps were whites from the suburbs and small towns. They either quit, failed, or they went on to become principals and moved into central office. They didn't stay with kids. They didn't change what happened. And the 80 colleges and universities just took the grants for the 9 years that we operated. Now, we did this for 9 years with 100,000 people. What more evidence do you need? But there's too much at stake here. You're not going to get schools of education out of the business of preparing teachers. You can criticize them all you want. The lobby groups that represent the schools of education are going to... And it's not just the lobby groups. The entire university benefits from producing non-teachers. The young girls who come to the university don't just take education courses. They take required courses in history and in math and in English. We wouldn't have liberal arts colleges in most of our universities if we didn't have gaboons, large numbers of young girls passing through as education majors who then never work in the 120 largest districts where they're needed. So it isn't just the education lobby that benefits. They are the cash cows. Who would take history courses? Who would take required math courses?
In a way, the biggest single category job training going on in colleges is teachers.
Of course.
Consequently,
So you get into these small towns, and who do you think that we have? Laundromat. You go to the laundromat. It's there because there's a college there. There's a gas station and an A&W root beer stand and an apartment house for parents to come. And if you go through the small towns of America, it's like building prisons in small towns. It's the economic base. It's the economic engine. So Siwash State in Nebraska, Elephant Nipple in Kansas, whatever these colleges are all across, as I mentioned, SUNY, they support the local communities. They support the local colleges. They all need schools of education with 19 and 20-year-old girls in them taking a lot of courses. The fact that they'll never teach
Doesn't have anything to do with it.
It's an economic engine that keeps the whole thing going. And then you say, well, how did this happen? Why are the teachers college? Nobody asks. Very few people ever ask. The few people ask, write a book, and I can take you to the library. Those books are never checked out. There's about 7 or 8 of them in our libraries, even in our best libraries, that deal with the history of teacher education. Very few of them. Less than a dozen, even in the most extensive library. And these were the colleges built in rural areas. They were never built. And they were never built to help diverse kids in poverty in big cities. They were built so that farm girls with a 6th grade education could go to a normal school for a year and get a job of work within 50 miles of home, come home in the summer to help with the chores, teach the kids to read the Bible. That was the only purpose of our schools, to read, but it was to read the Bible. And you had girls with 6th grade educations who took 1 more year of training, could work in a safe environment and be very cost effective to local taxpayers because you paid her so little. These girls replaced itinerant male who would go on horseback. Prior to the Civil War, there were itinerant males on horseback who would go from town to town and keep school for a month. And the local community would pay them and teach some kids to read. Yeah, right. But these guys charged more. It'd be cheaper to get a young girl, 18 years old, 17 years old, from the local community. And it was considered women's work. In fact, I can show you quotations from the first presidents of the teachers' colleges who would say, a career in teaching is not man's work. It's not man's work. So from the very outset, so the motives for building these normal schools, the motives for building these teacher education, if you look at the history, you understand why SUNY prepares 17,000 girls from Brockport and Fredonia and Oneonta, and none of them ever apply to New York. They're not from New York. They're victims of bad education themselves, and the women of America weren't taught math and science in schools. They're victims of a failed education, who now become the perpetrators by going to third-rate schools of education.
It seems like they're marketed to as if there is this opportunity.
That's right. We market like crazy. We market like crazy.
Then the teachers feel so frustrated and powerless and helpless when they
The people who are succeeding now, the models we have, what can be done. The models we have is we bring adults into teaching. We bring diverse adults, people 30 and over, people who look more like the kids they're teaching, who understand the cultures, the class problems. Many of them are themselves single parents. Many of them are themselves people who live in the community or in the city. Within every one of these failed systems, there are successful schools. There are individual schools that are successful. The problem is we don't know how to scale up. And the reason we don't know how to scale up is that it's impossible to scale up. Once you take a successful school in Milwaukee or in Chicago or any other city, say now we want every school to be like this, it can't be done because now you're involved with the bureaucracy. Now you're involved with the self-serving needs that get between the kids and the teachers and the things that I described.
things that are making the individual schoolwork.
That's right.
People,
That's right. It's got to be a small school. It's got to be close to the community. It's got to be free of the bureaucratic controls that are so self-serving for these other groups. We spend about $500 billion a year on education. Next to defense and health, there's the third largest outpouring of money to look at the results we're getting, for children in poverty and diverse children, any reasonable person has to be led to the conclusion that this is not accidental. The results we're getting are not accidental. There are things happening to this $500 billion that are systematically preventing.
But there's a diffused institutional ignorance, inertia, and collusion rather than central intelligence. Are you saying there's a central intelligence mafia?
No.
Okay.
No.
So we're talking about
No.
the way that they...
No, they're not that bright. In other words, the people in one city don't have to collude with the people in Newark, but they share the same values, which are, if I can make X amount as a school principal, why would I want to be a teacher?
Yeah, in other words, me first.
Me first. In other words, I can't use profanity on this tape.
I'll cut it out, don't worry about it.
Yes, you understand quite well. Well,
the fact that it is that, well, one of the things that I want to do now is I want to connect, get your sense of the connection between this problem and the reading component.
yeah.
Right?
Well, reading is a symptom of this problem. The reason we're having reading problems is symptomatic of these larger problems that I've described. Reading is a natural act. Most people who know how to read can't describe for you how they learned. They'll say something about, oh, I remember my dad or mom reading the comics to me. Or they'll say something about, well, I never really know when I actually learned. As far as I can recall, I was always... Reading is a natural act if you grow up in a natural way, in a home that has people who talk to you. If you start to develop language in a way where people interact with you, it's a natural act. When reading gets under the aegis of the school and into the hands of educators, it becomes an unnatural act. And it becomes a mysterious process, a set of mysterious procedures that have to be taught in certain sequences, and they divide themselves into various religious groups. There's the born-again phonics people, there's the reborn-again whole language people, and they're actually more like cults than religions. And they all have research to support. And the reason they all have research is that reading is such a natural thing for young children that just about anybody with enthusiasm who tries to teach them to read will be somewhat successful. That just about anybody who cares about the kids and spends some time with them. I've been impressed not with good reading methods. Let me explain what I mean. I've been most impressed by terrible reading methods. What you can get the various religions in reading to agree on is what's bad teaching. For example, taking 30 kids who are 6 years old but vastly different in ability to all devote the same amount of time and to all use exactly the same lesson, to ignore individual differences, in other words, and to have these 30 children chant the way you do in a church. So the teacher, there's responsive reading. The teacher reads, and the kids all read together. Here comes Dick. I see Dick. I can conjure up a vision which everybody will agree to is the absolute worst thing you could possibly do. And it doesn't matter what side of the reading argument they come from, they'll agree this is the absolute worst. And do you know what? I've seen kids learn to read this way. If they have an enthusiastic teacher who really cares about them and who really tries to help each one. Now, that's not to say there aren't better methods. There are better methods. There are better methods. But we can't control the commitment of the individual teacher. There's no method of reading that can withstand a teacher who doesn't believe in that method.
You're all right for the most part. You tend to move to the right, which is a great shot, or to the left, and I'm just catching in the middle. So you're doing fine.
Okay.
All right, we are rolling.
So clearly the level that the teacher embraces, believes, is excited about. We cannot, a teacher cannot be a robotic extension of some reading program, or there isn't enough affect.
That's right.
Engagement, connection.
Right. It's got to be a relationship with the kids. By the way, that's not just true of reading, it's true of science, math. Until we know the teacher can relate to the kids, can't teach anything. In other words, what most people call teaching is giving assignments and then monitoring assignments. Most teachers don't know the difference between teaching and assignment making. So what you see, or giving information. So what you see in most classes is the children are giving the teacher an opportunity to rehearse what she knows in front of them. Rehearsing what you know in front of children is not teaching any more than making assignments and then monitoring compliance. You have to have people who can relate to the kids. They want to be with the kids want to be with them. After they establish these relationships, then how much the teacher knows is of great importance. Then the teaching method that the teacher has is of great importance. And there are better methods than others. So that all of that, how much knowledge the teacher has, comes into play after the relationship is established. Now, the way we do it is exactly backwards. The way I've learned to do it with intern programs, with on-the-job training, with apprentice programs, with alternative programs, is we put teachers out right away with kids, and we can see if they can relate to them. If we can relate to the kids, we teach them how to teach on the job with a mentor or coach. If they can't, we get rid of them. What's done in schools of education is people take 60 credits of elementary education or 30 credits of secondary education plus student teaching, and they don't find out if they can actually relate to kids until it's all over. And they've invested 4 years taking meaningless pap from irrelevant people. What we have is ignorant people teaching the fearful to do the irrelevant. And that takes years of their time when they should be studying math and science and other things. And it misleads them, and they don't find out. The reason most of them never take jobs is they know more and are more honest about themselves than the people who prepared them and label them fully qualified. They don't try to go to Detroit or Chicago. They know they don't belong there. They can't relate to the kids. They know better than the people who profit from peddling them these irrelevant courses, then labeling them fully qualified. So we should be grateful to the ones who don't. But this ability to relate to the kids comes first. If you can relate to the kids, then how much science I know matters. If I can't relate to the kids, it doesn't matter how much science. If I can relate to the kids, then knowing how to teach science matters. If I can't relate to the kids, then it doesn't matter.
So
Okay.
you've developed assessment systems.
Yeah, yeah.
Put would-be teachers,
Right.
teachers that are being reviewed into an environment and monitor them for
Yes.
quality.
Plus I have an interview. I have an interview that's used in 170 cities, which predicts how well the people are going to relate to the kids and stay in a mindless bureaucracy. In other words, the interview predicts two things. It predicts who will work in a place that's organized against the kids and who will be able to establish relationships with kids who don't always do pleasant things. So between the interview and the first month on the job, the interview is accurate to over 90%, but there's still large numbers of people that you won't be able to judge until you actually see them. There'll be some people who you think might be able to relate to the kids. So there'll be some error in the interview. It's not a wordless thing, no. It's not defining words, but it deals with questions like, suppose you have a kid that doesn't do any homework, what are you going to do? Now, whatever the answers are to the interview, that's a very good question. Whatever the answers are to the interview, don't come from me, and they don't come from best practice research. The best answers to the interview come from great teachers who are now doing it. So when you respond to, what would you do with a kid who doesn't do his homework, your answer is judged. Is your answer more like a failure quitter who's not getting results with the kids and just passing through? Or is your answer more like what a star teacher says? So your answer is judged in terms of its appropriateness for the situations we're talking about. And so that enables us to predict, because we are putting people to essentially learn on the job in matters of life and death. That undergirds everything we do or don't do. If you don't believe that this is a matter of life and death, and most people don't, they think of it, it's a good job for Bob or Betty Boop, who's now 23 and has a college degree and needs a job or work. The biggest problem we have for the kids right now is that we're in a recession. Jobs are difficult to get. Getting the teachers that we need is easier in a boom. In a boom period, the people who try teaching and don't like it leave. In a recession, when it's tough to get jobs, the people who can't relate to the kids stay, because even at $30,000, they can't get a job elsewhere. And they can't get 60% benefit package, including health insurance. So what we now have, what we're entering in the period we're now in, is a period where it's going to be really tough on the kids, because we're having strong insensitives staying longer. A teaching career is still only 11 years. But in the big cities, the burnout rate and the turnover was much less, so it was better. In other words, it takes about 3 years to figure out what you're doing. It takes about 9 or 10 years to get burned out. So what you really get in the big cities is you get about 6 or 7 years of maximum time of the good people. I'm not talking about 22-year-olds, I'm talking about the adults with knowledge and with life experience and work experience that we should be bringing into teaching. We can hope for 6 or 7 years of them at top form before they themselves start to burn out. If they're really great and they burn out, they're still pretty good. But if they start out satisfactory and they burn out, they lapse into bad things. So what's not appreciated in the teacher education business is that the general economic conditions control this pass-through the profession that has a profound impact on kids if the strong insensitives won't leave. And then in every big city, you've got maybe 40% of the faculty that are now earning $55,000, $60,000, $65,000. They'll never leave. They'll work right through to retirement, and they're burnouts and quitters, and they're just going to stay there. So there's maybe over 40% of the faculty in most of the cities are these strong insensitives that we're just stuck with. So that presents a problem. But the general economic condition of the time, particularly health insurance and the cost of health insurance has a greater control on the quality of teaching than any of the things that educational researchers talk about. If you can connect the dots with what I've just been talking about, recession, costs, who stays in the profession. So we tend to think of health costs as just a problem. It really has a direct impact, yes, on who stays in teaching.
So your teacher test, your assessment system, it's a way of weeding out,
Yeah.
a way of making things more efficient. But if a number of people are using it, that means there are a number of schools that are interested in being more efficient.
Yeah. Yeah, but the problem there, what we try to do is when a district hires our people, we try to have them group them in one school. People who do the hiring tend to think of teachers, they just pass them out. They don't think, well, we have a school that's failing here. Why don't we put 8 or 10 of them in one? If we can group them, we can.
That would mean re-engineering and overhauling the particular school rather than.
That's right. Then we can have an impact on. The interview is also good with veteran teachers, so that if a school district has schools in need of improvement, SINI, under the Leave No Child Behind Act, they could restaff with veterans and beginning people who have these relationship skills based on the interview. We've done that in a school in Houston and in a school in Buffalo, where we've been able to reconstitute a school with teachers who pass the interview. And it changes the school. You have a...
Ideally, you'd like to be able to get enough of a mass of teachers that have actually come through this to see some kind of comparative basis.
But in that situation, you also need a good principal. So we've developed another interview which predicts who can be a good principal, which is a whole other set of problems on what leadership is in these schools. But the point is that there can be individually successful schools regardless of how bad the system is. And every system, you could go to any city and find individually successful schools, but they'll be very few in number. They'll be very, very few in number.
Thank you. This is all great. So, during our phone conversation, you mentioned one of the threads of our conversation was the literacy of teachers themselves,
Yeah.
particularly of the teachers that are in the K3, K4, the most critical, zone for getting kids off of the reading.
Yeah. Well, I'm very worried about that. I mentioned that earlier when I talked about victims becoming perpetrators. The people we should help through college and in college to develop communication skills are a predictor of teacher effectiveness. The ability to communicate in writing and orally undergird your ability to relate to other people and to community people and to parents and to coworkers and so on, so that there's various forms of knowledge that teachers need. What I'm discussing now are just general communication skills. Then there's another realm of knowledge that deals with the teacher as a learner. Is the teacher a reading person? Is the teacher reading anything? Is the teacher growing? The teacher can't model a love of learning if they're not reading or thinking or doing things themselves as learners. We say we want children to become self-directed learners. We say we want children to be lifelong learners. These are cliches. These are the way you can get at that is by having teachers who are themselves learners and who share love of books, writing, learning stuff, going places, doing things. I've had about 5,000 interviews. In the last 42 years, I've had about 5,000 interviews personally myself. And there's a tremendous number of people interviewing as teachers or to be in teacher programs. When you ask questions like, tell me some of your interests, or tell me some of the things you're reading right now, don't have any interests and aren't reading anything right now. And that that's okay for college graduates. We have some college graduates who brag they never read a book all the way through except to get ready for a test or something. But if a person becomes a teacher, that's different than if they take some other course. They should read books through. They should have a love of learning and interest in developing some avocation, some hobby. They should be. That's not to say teaching is an intellectual process. Teaching is not an intellectual process. An intellectual is somebody who thinks the greatest thing in life is an idea. Those people fail as teachers. But we have to have people with human relation skills who do have academic and intellectual interests. Teachers who are successful think the most important thing are people and my ability to relate to these kids. But they have to be people who have ideas, who are interested in ideas, who read stuff, who are learning stuff, who have hobbies. And of these 5,000 interviews, I can't give you the percent, but there's a substantial minority of people in education who I've interviewed who will say, when I ask them, could you tell me something you're really interested in? What are you reading now? Could you tell me about a hobby you have? And I have no standards. I don't care whether it's Russian opera or saving coins or Greek mythology or fishing or gardening, or I have no standards or criteria. I'm just asking, could you tell me something you're learning, something you're interested that you pursue? Because I know unless you model for the kids something that you care about learning, they're not going to learn learning by you giving out assignments and marking tests. They're not going to develop an affect, a care about learning. They're going to catch that. Values are caught, not taught. So unless you have a relationship and then are a person who has some ideas. We have a lot of people, if they ever had an idea, would be lonely. And they think it's just...
The idea that they're on them. They're on.
They're on.
Fire. They're on passion for something.
For something, yeah. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what.
Kids can get caught.
Sure, that's right. Because if somebody is really passionate about scuba diving, the kids are going to learn about gases, about meters, about equipment, about water pressure. They're going to learn an awful lot. In other words, whatever it is you model, as they identify with you, they're going to be turned on to learning. But if you have people who are vacuous, I'm not talking about majoring in stuff. The usual arguments are, well, we want you to be an undergraduate major. If you check adults, you'll find that they were undergraduate majors in history, but they haven't ever read a history book since they graduated. Commissioner Baseball was an undergraduate major in history. So what? I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being interested in learning, really. Next time you're with 50 teachers in a class, pass out a paper and say, tell me the title of a book that's on your night table that you read every night before you fall asleep. Oh, maybe somebody will say, I read the Bible. Fine. But aside from that, are you reading a book? What's the name of the last book you read? When were you in the library? Well, I go online now. I don't have to go to the library. You can't teach what you don't know about places you ain't never been. If you've never experienced the joy of learning, your hope of turning somebody else on is -6.
Right. But if you're on and active in learning, even if you don't know about it, you can be a conduit that children
Oh, sure.
behind learning.
If you establish a relationship with the kids, then the kids see you as a model. They say, well, maybe there's something there. If he seems to be turned on by making his own glasses, maybe I ought to try making my own glasses. Maybe grinding lenses is interesting. I don't know. But you got to know an awful lot to do that. And you got to be reading a book about that, and so on and so on. And my standards are low. If you're interested in reading English mysteries, okay. What is there about English mysteries you like? What do you want to share with the kids about that? There's got to be something you care about. I've interviewed people who sit there and think for 30 seconds and then say, well, I shop, I go shopping. Say, well, fine, and why don't you get a job at McDonald's? Why don't you get a job in the department store? You might enjoy that because you'll get a discount.
Pretty amazing.
We met with some teachers on Kauai, just a little story. Met with some teachers on Kauai in a high school, and we're talking with them. There were the principal was there, and the reading coordinator, and 9th grade teacher, and a 10th grade teacher. And I kind of sat there and they listened to us, and this woman just sat there the whole time, just pucker faced, right? And so finally, her comment was, look, I don't know if you've worked with teenagers much, but they're basically hopeless.
Mm-hmm.
She said that.
Sure.
And my jaw dropped, and I bit my tongue and said, oh,
She represents.
get a new job.
She represents at least 40%.
Sadly,
At least, and that may be an underestimate, but I'm giving you the benefit of my experience in just 120 districts. She may represent more than 40% in some districts. They can't relate to the kids. They reject the kids. I mean, and and if you talk to them in greater depth than you reporting, they'll eventually say something like, I have a life. When I leave the building, I have a life. I have my own family. I have my own. As I said earlier in the interview, you can't assume that the people who work in schools care about kids any more than people who work in other walks of life. They're working in schools for the job, for the health insurance, for their own families, to realize the American dream. Politicians explain the American dream as owning your own home. They don't explain the American dream as learning, support, citizenship. Politicians explain the American dream as having a job and owning your own home. And that's what most people think the American dream is. So if you have a job in a school, well, then you can own your own home. And it's nothing to do about learning.
I think this happens all over, and even more so in small towns. I can think of small towns. I can think
Oh,
of
sure.
a small town in particular where my two aunts are teachers.
Sure.
And why? Because
Sure.
there aren't any other jobs in the town.
That's right.
If you're not working at the bank, the post office,
Sure.
or the hospital.
Sure.
you
I
don't
never
have a
say that.
job.
I'm glad you're saying that. My experience has been limited to cities. I know that what I'm saying is true for America generally, but I can't claim that because my experiences have all been in big cities. So I'm hoping that people will think what you're thinking and say, this was true in my town, this was true in my suburb, this was true in my farm area.
Yeah, but it's normal.
It's normal.
What's interesting about the small town paradigm is that people will grow up in this small town school where this is the reality of the
That's right.
world. And
That's
that
right.
everything is viewed through television. This is the concepts of what they're building, their whole virtual reality of what it is to exist and what the world is.
That's right.
They'll go to a small school, a small college,
Right.
for a couple of years, a dinky little college.
And become a
get their
teacher.
degree, become a teacher, and come right back to the small town.
That's
And
exactly.
I'm saying this because
No, this is what
I've seen it
you've just
happen.
summarized the
They're
process.
They're the parents of these kids, and these kids are coming through the school, and these are the same people that went to high school, that grew up.
I wish you were on the interview. You're summarizing why we can't have schools of education do any better, because they represent third and fourth rate institutions with third and fourth rate people.
And third and fourth grade generations are
Right,
going through
right.
the same school system, by the same,
Yeah, right.
the same paradigms.
That's right.
And the same secretary.
Schools
who's
reflect
controlling
the point,
income
right.
Has been working there for 40 years.
Right. What I would like to put on the interview is schools not only reflect society, teacher education reflects society. just the way schools reflect their towns. That's right, just the way schools reflect, so does teacher education. You can't expect teacher education to be any better than American society. Now, I do because we select different populations, but it's always an uphill battle. We call them new populations of people. Why? Because they're over 30, or because they might not be white, or because they may have worked in a job in another town, or they don't live in... They're all... The model is still a stereotype. An 18 to 22-year-old, full-time, going to college, becomes a school teacher, goes to a good university because there's a school of engineering, and then they meet a man who's an engineer or a business major, and then she's the kindergarten teacher, and he gets a job in an engineering firm. And this is, or a law school, or so. So the males go. Now, we've had some change with the women's rights movement, and women of higher ability have gone into business and law school, but it still doesn't change the paradigm of who's filling the schools of education. There are a lot of primary teachers who do know math and science, but they're the exception. The reason most become primary majors is so they won't have to study math and science. That's the reason. So if you become a first grade teacher or a kindergarten teacher because you're trying to run away from math and science, it's not an accident that our kids can read the word Tuesday, but not be able to explain what a day is. It's not an accident that young children can read the word summer, but not be able to explain what causes summer. They've been systematically taught by victims who became perpetrators, who don't know any math or science, and who don't know what causes summer. So the children are not interested in what causes summer, or what causes Tuesday, or what causes the lake to get cold. They read the word lake. And even then, we can't even teach them to read. In other words, we've taken the substance out of the curriculum. We've taken the math and science out. We've taken and made it a process. Now we're just going to emphasize, the hell with what causes summer. Let's just teach them to call the word when they see it on the word wall. So,
To be correct in saying the word,
right,
than
right.
understanding what it means.
And we can't even do that. So we lowered the standards to now a process. Remember, reading is not a content.
Who cares what causes summer? That's when you don't have to be in school.
That's right.
I
That's
think
right.
That's the most
That's right.
way that the kids would have.
The kids would be interested in what causes summer. The teacher would say, who cares what causes summer? The teacher will say, who cares what causes? 5-year-old would be very interested in what causes summer. Torrance's study on creativity found that at 5, the average 5-year-old American kid was in the top 10% on any test he could ever devise of creativity. And when they were 15, the average 15-year-old was in the bottom 10% on any, and then he would raise the question, what happens to children between 5 and 15 that causes them to move from the top to the bottom on any measure of creativity?
Insidious curriculum.
Being with people who don't have an interest in learning, who are interested in reading but not understanding, reading for not understanding more science and math and social studies, but reading for reading, just to call words and say, I'm a good reading teacher. We give courses. When you see what kids actually read in schools, my God, and what they could be reading, When you look at the texts, and that again is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
I have a question of the interviews that you do that are administered in the districts that you but what's the next step after the interview? Is this just something that the schools they have on file and can say, okay, we want to get this person, you know, what's the next step after the interview?
Well, various districts, if it's veteran teachers, then they might be using the interview just to stock a school that's failing, see if they can turn it around. Most of the times the interview is used with beginning teachers, and it's part of a very lengthy process that a district uses. They make a criminal check, they get references, they look at test scores, they look at certification. It's just one piece in a very big decision that a district makes, and hopefully, if they do it first, if they use our interview first, then everything else they do will be okay because it won't matter. They will already have the right people, so whatever else they do to them. But if they use our interview last, they will screen out a lot of good people and bring in a lot of bad. So we always advise them, use our interview first. And then you know you've got people who can relate to the kids and learn on the job and grow. And now if you want to have your own interviews, if you want to give, some states have tests of subject matter. Some states have tests of professional knowledge. Some states have tests of various. So it varies from district to district what else they do. One of the things that districts do now that's absolutely despicable is, in the name of efficiency, they're hiring people without ever seeing, nobody sees or speaks to them. In other words, you take a test on a computer or online, or you take it on the phone. You send in all your papers, you go through 8 or 10 steps, and then you get a letter that says you're hired. So that it's possible to get a job in many cities in the United States without speaking to another human being. Now, if you wanted a job washing cars part-time, if you wanted a job putting towels in a washing machine in the basement of a hotel, you would have to speak to another human being to get that job. No matter how menial or low level or low pay or low status a job is in our society, you have to speak to another human being to get it. Except if you want to be a teacher in one of the big cities. In many of the big cities, it's possible to end up with a letter that says, "Dear Miss Jones, congratulations and welcome to our family. You are now a teacher in the X school system. And we look forward to working with you," and so on. And people with brains and sensitivity know that they don't want to work in such a system. It'd be like passing a man on the street who says, "Hey, you want to get married?" A person of intelligence knows that that's not a compliment. If you've been through paper, mailing paper, receiving paper, and taking a computer test, and somebody hires you as a teacher, you know that that system doesn't value people and certainly is not interested in protecting children. You can't get a job selling ice cream on the beach without talking to somebody. Only teaching. It's an interesting spectacle. It goes back to the very first question you raised an hour and a half ago. It's pseudoscience, you know. We have a test, a score. We have some scientific way. My interview is not foolproof. My interview is a good way to tell you who can relate to kids, but there's a lot of other things.
And it presumes that the district agrees with the basic.
Right.
Otherwise, they can stick it on number 10.
Right.
It's one of the attributes.
Right.
The
Exactly.
attribute in the decision tree.
Exactly. And it assumes that you now are going to check, do they know any content? If they're going to teach French, they should know French. And if they're going to teach English, whatever they're going to teach, you should have some knowledge of how much. One of the things that should be done that's never done is we should hold hiring offices in the district. I've said teacher education is unaccountable and irrelevant to the teachers and the kids. But the school districts themselves, the people who do the hiring in the cities, are not held accountable for the people they hire. So if I work in human resources in a particular city and I hire Mr. Smith to teach math in a high school, nobody ever comes back to me and say, this is November. He just hit a kid and was arrested. Nobody ever says, why'd you hire him? Or his test scores are the lowest in the history of that high school. Why did you hire that person? Or he never shows up to work and he just resigned. Why did you hire that person? In other words, nobody ever draws a line. And even more insidious than that is the personnel directors, the people in human resources who do the hiring, are not stupid. They know that accountability is a specter lurking over them that can do away with their sinecures. An undeserved job. Okay. So the process involves 8 different people. In other words, this person does the criminal checks. This person does the online interviews. This person does the references. So when it comes to who hired that person, 8 different people were involved in it. That's right.
Deniability.
That's right. So there's no way to say, we just built a high school in this town, we put 5 new teachers in it, and they all quit or failed in the first year. Who hired these people? You can't go back to your own personnel office with any accountability threat because they've gone through procedures to prevent that from happening.
A lot of these problems seem to me to trace down to this, that, for example, as far back as building the Great Wall of China, there are people that are building the bricks for it or inscribing their name on it. It turns out 30 years later that the wall falls down at that spot, their children are going to get axed for it, right? And there's this accountability because the production of whatever it is a person's doing is clear and distinct and measurable. When today a factory worker at Boeing puts together some part of a sensor array on a wingtip, right? They can trace back that person, what they did to the performance of that particular thing. But when it comes down to educating children, there's this entirely different fuzziness about what's going on. It's not a product that we can measure.
It's not an accident. It's a systematic avoidance that will prevent you from ever holding me accountable for anything. And as a professor of education, as a distinguished professor of education, I'm probably the most unaccountable. I can't be held accountable for anything. Zip. So I'm in a perfect position, you see, in terms of the accountability chain.
Right. What I'm questioning is how much of this lack of accountability that radiates throughout the system comes down to the fact that what this whole system is doing is unlike any other system. It's not like building rockets or airplanes.
But there still needs to be accountability in it.
Agree. But ultimately, accountability is usually tied to performance.
Right.
Right. And we have such various fuzzy models. I mean, for example, and I want to come back to this. You said reading's natural, right? There's a huge army of people, and I happen to be on that side of this particular issue, that would say that the notion that reading is natural, held by the colleges of education, is a huge problem. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the arguments over these ideas about what learning is and what reading is and how to teach it and all this.
Well,
this
colleges of education don't believe it's a natural act. We offer all kinds of courses. We create the reading experts. We've created the whole field. I'm saying that, but I'm not speaking for colleges. I'm speaking.
I think that that in fact, researchers that I talk to that are upset with the colleges of education, who are to look at like who are the Stephen Krashens or the Richard Allingtons or people that are on a certain side of the fence in their reading war from out on the whole language world. One of their first things is that it's natural. Right? It's natural. And it's bizarre how you can hold that view. I mean, how people can hold that view, right? And yet people do. And and the difference between that view and a view that, no, it's incredibly unnatural and artificial challenge to the brain, resolving down to what's going on in 20 milliseconds of processing time between, visual and auditory processes and da-da-da-da. And these kind of things keep us from having a coherent alignment that we can say, okay, based on this, now we can assess, now we can determine what performance is.
No, you're right when you define it that way. When I use the word natural, I mean that it's natural that kids would want to learn to read.
Okay, sure.
It's natural that kids would enjoy reading and be readers. It's natural that kids would want to know not just their own experience, but experiences of...
It's another dimensional realm.
I'm talking about the motivation,
okay.
and because when you look into schools, you see kids who hate it and so on. But you're entirely right. Physically,
because
they've been taught that way.
They've come to feel shame at the kind of confusion it brings about to engage in, which is an environmental problem, not them.
Right.
So I'm glad that we got that.
Sure.
And I do agree that the child's natural inclination, being around people that read, seeing printed materials, is to want to learn into it until they learn that there's something wrong with them when they try.
Sure. The 3- and 4-year-olds in China regard it as a natural act because it's painting pictures and they enjoy it.
It is much more natural.
And so by 5, they know 2,400 characters, and we only have 26, and we can't teach them the sounds of the 26.
We have 1,100 ways the 26 letters and the 44 sounds interact, and they all have to be resolved in 20 milliseconds of brain processing.
Right.
There's not a simple correspondence of image and sound like there is in the other systems, and so it's a radically less natural extension of our oral language speaking system than, for example, a graphic system like China. So it's not that, that's what I'm saying, and in some respects, it's like the model of learning. My sense is teachers, for the most part, the system as a whole, including some of the best teachers that I've encountered, proceed from the assumption that what we've got to teach at any given instant, if we could slice through time of the interaction between teacher and child, is more important than the quality of participation from the inside out happening in the learning. How could we ever hold that view?
Well, people who can't think very well can hold that view. People whose motives for being there are different than yours can hold that view. One of the things we did 1,000 years ago when we had a lab school here on campus is for various things in science and various things in different subjects, we'd have people off the street teach it and compare it to how well they did against the teachers. We once had a unit on electricity taught by the janitors where they did much better than the science. The kids learned a lot more than they did with the science teachers. And a lot relates to who the people are. If you have somebody that cares about the knowledge and who's interested in the knowledge and who...
In the case here, the janitor didn't connect with the children.
Connects with the kids.
Learning in creates
wants the kids to know what he does. Wants
Someone
to
who's happy in life and engaged in learning. And
engage in learning. Yeah, this is not mysterious. What I'm telling you is not mysterious. What I'm telling you is not mysterious.
No, but it's very misunderstood. It's not understood. It's
we don't want to understand. We profit from not understanding it.
No, we don't. We have a perception that we do, but when you, like you said, we spent $119 billion on the Iraqi war since it began, right?
Yeah.
Since 9/11. The costs of reading alone, reading-related social pathologies, direct costs of instruction, and what have you, are many times that. And like you said, $500 billion. in education.
every year.
Right? And yet 88% of fourth grade black children are reading below proficiency, meaning that they're growing up feeling like there's something wrong with their minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or rejecting learning or rejecting themselves.
To protect themselves from what
Yeah.
it feels like to feel like you're no good.
Right.
Is there anything that you think that we haven't touched on that you got a passion button about?
Well, I think I've had a chance to explain my views on stuff.
Appreciate your sharing.
Yeah, I do too. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, stay in touch with me, and I'd like to know if I'd like to see whatever you come up with if I could have a copy.
You will.
You will.
Yeah.
And we'll have to get transcripts to you too. Don't walk away with your mind. Do you and we're going to explore.
Years ago we called it
Outdoor education. It's recreation, outdoor recreation, environmental
Oh, there's
education.
no question, that's true.
And that's
That's
where
why
I have come
good
in
summer
contact.
camps, you find kids learning so much more at good summer camps.
Yeah, and you know what? There's one thing for sure.